"You're just a delivery guy." That's what George said right before he shredded the wrong piece of paper. He didn't know the person he humiliated had the authority to end his career without raising his voice. And in the next few minutes, every assumption in that room would collapse. Because the man standing in front of him wasn't lost. He was counting. If you believe everyone should be treated equally, then subscribe to this channel to join the fight against injustice. Andrew Lewis pushed against the heavy glass door of Prestige timepieces, his shoulder throbbing from the weight of the delivery bag that had been digging into his skin all morning. He didn't look up at the security guard, and the guard barely looked at him, dismissing the man in the sweat-stained brown uniform as just another gear in the city's logistics machine. Every step Andrew took across the polished floor sent a sharp reminder through his left knee, a jagged souvenir from a rainy night on a track years ago that had ended his athletic career and landed him in a corporate uniform instead of a podium. The air inside was filtered and dry, smelling faintly of expensive paper and ozone. Andrew stood near the edge of the main showroom, his faded cap pulled low, waiting for someone to acknowledge his presence. To his left, a couple in tailored wool coats leaned over a display case, their voices a low murmur of carrots and complications. They looked through Andrew as if he were a ghost or a piece of cleaning equipment left out by mistake. He checked his watch, a rugged, scratched digital piece that looked like an insult in a room full of Swiss mechanicals, and calculated how long it would take for the test to begin. He adjusted the strap of his bag, feeling the crinkle of the manifest inside. He wasn't there to buy anything, and in a place like this, that made him invisible to most and a target to others. A few feet away, a younger clerk was busy polishing a glass surface, her eyes darting toward him for a fraction of a second before she looked away, her expression a mix of pity and hesitation. Andrew kept his face neutral, his gaze fixed on the back office door where he knew the manager would eventually emerge. He wasn't just delivering a package. He was carrying the fate of this branch's reputation in his hand, and the weight of it felt heavier than the bag on his shoulder. George Reed didn't just walk toward the counter. He marched, his polished shoes clicking with a rhythm that signaled he was coming to clear an obstruction. He stopped inches from the display case, his eyes raking over Andrew's sweat-stained brown uniform and the faded cap with a look of pure physical distaste. Andrew held out the digital tablet for a signature, but George didn't even reach for the stylus. Instead, his hand shot out and snatched the backup paper manifest tucked into the side pocket of Andrew's bag. George looked at the document, then back at Andrew, a small, sharp smile forming on his face. "You've got a lot of nerve walking through the front door looking like you just crawled out from under a delivery van," George said, his voice loud enough to make a nearby customer turn their head. Andrew kept his voice level, his hand still holding the tablet. "I just need a signature for the priority intake, sir. It's a direct handoff requirement." George chuckled, a dry sound that had no humor in it. "Requirements? You're a guy in a brown shirt carrying a bag. You don't get to have requirements in a place like this." Without warning, George gripped the top of the manifest with both hands. With a slow, deliberate motion, he ripped the thick paper down the middle. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet room. He didn't stop there. He crossed the tiers, shredding the document into 4 pieces before letting them flutter out of his fingers. The white fragments landed on the floor, contrasting sharply with the dark surface. George leaned over the counter, his navy suit sleeve brushing against the glass. "There's your signature," he whispered, his eyes mocking Andrew's stunned silence. "Now pick up your trash and use the alleyway entrance where the rest of the help goes. If I see you in my showroom again, I'm calling the police to report a loiter." Andrew looked down at the shredded remains of the manifest, the very document that contained the corporate tracking codes for the audit, and felt the weight of his task get significantly heavier. George didn't move away after dropping the shredded paper. He lingered, his eyes traveling down to Andrew's left leg. Andrew shifted his weight to ease the dull throb in his knee, a movement that caused a slight, unavoidable hitch in his posture. George noticed it immediately and let out a short, mocking breath that was almost a whistle. "And look at that," George said, loud enough for a nearby businessman to smirk. "Coming in here dragging your leg like you're doing us a favor just by standing upright. You've got that real street face look going on today, Andrew. Andrew's grip tightened on the strap of his bag, his knuckles turning white, but his expression remained a mask of professional patience. George leaned further over the counter, his voice dropping into a conspiratorial tone that felt like a needle. Seriously, with that limp and that battered bag, you look like you're looking for a handout, not making a delivery. Are you even sure you're here for a drop-off? He pointed a manicured finger at the bulge in Andrew's heavy shoulder bag. What have you got hidden in there, anyway? Besides more trash? Maybe something that doesn't belong to you. The accusation hung in the air, heavy and sharp. A woman at a nearby display case pulled her purse slightly closer to her body, her eyes darting toward Andrew with sudden suspicion. George saw the reaction and his smirk widened. Fueled by the audience, he had successfully turned against the man in the brown uniform. I've seen guys like you before, George continued, his voice regaining its volume. You use the uniform as a shield. You limp around to look harmless, wait for someone to look away, and then something expensive ends up in that backpack of yours. Andrew took a slow, measured breath, the kind he used to take before the starting gun fired on the track. The bag contains the secure intake units for this branch's quarterly inventory, Andrew said, his voice low and steady. George didn't even blink. He just laughed again, a sound filled with the arrogance of a man who thought he was untouchable. Inventory? You can barely manage to keep your balance, let alone handle our inventory. Give it up, kid. You're just a delivery guy who walked into the wrong room. And frankly, you're starting to smell like the sidewalk you came off of. George made a shooing motion with his hand, dismissing Andrew like he was nothing more than a stray dog that had wandered into a gallery. George turned his back on Andrew the moment a woman draped in a heavy wool coat stepped through the door, his face instantly transforming from a sneer into a mask of professional warmth. While he busied himself with a high-stakes sale, Sarah Jenkins, who had been watching the exchange from the corner of the showroom, saw Andrew's knee buckle slightly as he tried to maintain his balance. She didn't look at his uniform or the dirt on his sneakers. She saw the sweat on his forehead and the way he was breathing through the pain. Sarah moved quietly, slipping out from behind the counter while George was occupied with a velvet tray of watches. She didn't make a scene. She simply leaned in close to Andrew, her voice a barely audible whisper that didn't reach the ears of the filming onlookers or the distracted manager. I am so sorry, she said, her eyes genuinely pained by what she had just witnessed. He shouldn't have done that to your paperwork. It's not right. Andrew looked at her, surprised by the sudden break in the wall of hostility. Sarah didn't wait for him to respond. She reached out and pulled a small, unobtrusive stool from behind a nearby pedestal, placing it directly behind him. Please, sit down for a moment. You're hurt, she urged, her voice steady despite the risk she was taking. Andrew hesitated, his training telling him to stay on his feet, but the human kindness in her gesture was harder to ignore than George's insults. As he lowered himself onto the seat, Sarah quickly grabbed a small paper cup of water from the back station and pressed it into his hand. Don't mind them, she whispered, glancing back to ensure George was still deep in his sales pitch. Not everyone here thinks like that. Andrew took a sip, the cool water hitting his throat as he watched Sarah quickly return to her post before George could notice her absence. In a room filled with people who saw him as a type or a threat, Sarah was the only one who saw him as a person, and Andrew made a silent note that her name was the first thing that would go into his final report. The tires of 3 heavy, black SUVs crunched against the curb directly in front of the showroom's floor-to-ceiling windows. The engines cut off in unison, creating a sudden, heavy silence that made everyone in the store look up. George Reed immediately straightened his tie, his face lighting up with the frantic energy of a man expecting a windfall. He shoved past Andrew, nearly knocking the water cup out of his hand, and rushed toward the entrance. Now this, George muttered, loud enough for the room to hear, is what actual importance looks like. Sarah, get the high-security trays ready. The glass doors were pulled open by men in dark suits who didn't look like customers. They stepped inside with a focused, professional efficiency, their eyes scanning the corners of the room before Julian Vane stepped through the center. Julian didn't look at the watches or the polished displays. He walked with a grim, purposeful stride that signaled a storm was coming. George was already there, his hand outstretched and a practiced, sycophantic grin plastered across his face. "Mr. Vane, what an unexpected honor. If I had known you were visiting this branch today, I would have." Julian didn't even slow down. He didn't look at the hand George was holding out. He walked right past the manager as if he were a mannequin, his eyes locked on the back of the room where Andrew sat on the small stool Sarah had provided. George's hand hung in the air, his grin faltering as he spun around, confused. "Sir? The VIP suite is this way. We have the new collection." Julian ignored him again. He stopped directly in front of Andrew. The men in suits fanned out behind him, creating a wall that cut George off from his own showroom. Julian looked down at the shredded pieces of paper on the floor, then at the sweat on Andrew's brow, and finally at the bruised pride in Andrew's eyes. Julian reached out and placed a firm, respectful hand on Andrew's shoulder. "I got the signal, Andrew," Julian said, his voice echoing in the sudden quiet of the store. It wasn't the voice of a boss talking to a delivery driver. It was the voice of a man talking to an equal. "I'm sorry it took us 10 minutes to get around the block. Give it to me straight. How bad is it here?" Andrew stood up slowly, his knee clicking, but his posture was no longer that of a tired courier. He looked Julian in the eye and then turned his gaze toward George, whose face had gone from confusion to a sickly, pale shade of gray. The power in the room didn't just shift. It vanished from George's hands entirely. Andrew didn't wait for George to find his voice. He stood up, and while the limp was still there, a physical reality of his injury, the hunch in his shoulders vanished. He looked less like a man burdened by a heavy bag and more like a man holding a gavel. He didn't raise his voice, but the sudden authority in his tone made the security team tighten their perimeter. "I have been in this showroom for exactly 14 minutes, Andrew said, his voice cutting through the heavy silence. He didn't look at George yet. He looked directly at Julian Vane. "In that time, I have recorded 6 major violations of the Corporate Conduct Code and 3 potential legal liabilities for the firm. It started before I even reached the counter." George took a stumbling step forward, his face a ghostly shade of white. "Mr. Vane, there's been a massive misunderstanding. This man, he came in unannounced. He looked like a human being doing his job," Andrew interrupted, finally turning his gaze toward George. The manager flinched as if Andrew had struck him. Andrew didn't use flowery language. He spoke with the clinical precision of a man who spent his life analyzing data. Violation 1. Verbal harassment based on physical appearance and perceived socioeconomic status. You used the term street face and mocked a permanent physical disability resulting from a workplace injury. Violation 2. Destruction of official company property. You snatched and shredded a high-priority manifest containing encrypted intake codes, rendering the morning's logistics data useless. Andrew stepped closer to the counter, pointing to the white fragments on the floor. Violation 3. Intimidation. You intentionally breached my personal space to force an exit rather than following the standard refusal of delivery protocol. Violation 4. Slander. You accused me, in front of witnesses and active recording devices, of potential theft with zero probable cause, simply because you didn't like the color of my uniform. The customers who had been filming for entertainment now lowered their phones, the atmosphere shifting from a spectacle to a sentencing. Andrew looked back at Julian. And the most critical failure, Julian, is the systemic culture here. Except for one employee, the staff remained silent or participated in the mockery. This isn't just a bad manager, it's a failed environment. The brand integrity we spent 30 years building was dismantled in under 15 minutes by a man who thinks a suit is a license to be a bully. George tried to speak, but only a dry, rattling sound came out of his throat. He looked around his showroom, but the people who had been laughing with him moments ago were now looking at the floor, distancing themselves from the wreckage of his career. Andrew reached into his delivery bag and pulled out a slim, high-end digital recorder that had been active since he stepped off the sidewalk. "It's all on here," Andrew said, handing the device to Julian. "Every word, every laugh, and the sound of that paper tearing. I believe the audit is complete. Julian Vane took the digital recorder, but Andrew wasn't finished. He reached back into the battered delivery bag and pulled out the actual package George had refused to accept. It wasn't a box of jewelry or a stack of promotional flyers. It was a heavy, moisture-resistant legal envelope with the corporate seal of Vane Logistics and holding stamped in red across the flap. Andrew held it out, but not toward George. He held it so the customers and the staff could see the bold black lettering on the front. "You told me earlier that this place doesn't handle trash from the street," Andrew said, his voice flat and steady. "But this trash is actually a formal notice of immediate receivership and a litigation hold. We didn't send a courier because we were short on staff. We sent me because this envelope contains 3 years of documented complaints from delivery personnel, service workers, and minority clients who were treated exactly the way I was treated today." George's eyes darted from the envelope to Julian's face, his mouth working silently like a fish out of water. Andrew tapped the torn pieces of paper on the floor with the toe of his sneaker. "That manifest you enjoyed shredding? That wasn't just a delivery slip. It was a court-admissible chain of custody document for this evidence. By destroying it, you didn't just break a store rule, George. You committed spoliation of evidence in an active corporate investigation." Andrew slid the legal envelope onto the glass counter, right over the spot where George had been leaning moments ago. "The package contains the internal audit results and the legal notice of your suspension pending a full criminal review for workplace discrimination. I was the delivery guy because I needed to see if you would follow the basic legal requirement of accepting a formal notice. You failed. You chose to laugh at the messenger instead of reading the message." Julian Vane stepped forward, his shadow falling over the counter. "The paper trail for your behavior didn't start today, George. It ends today." He turned to one of the men in suits. "Secure the server room. I want every minute of today's CCTV footage backed up and off-site within the hour. Andrew has the audio. I want the high-definition proof of the moment he ripped that document." Andrew looked at Sarah, who was still standing by the water station, her face pale, but her eyes wide with a strange sense of relief. He then looked back at George, who was now staring at the legal envelope as if it were a live grenade. "You were so busy looking at my limp and my old sneakers," Andrew said quietly, "that you never bothered to look at the name on the manifest. If you had, you would have seen my title. But I suppose that's the point of the test. You only respect the title, never the person." Julian Vane didn't raise his voice, but the finality in it made the air in the showroom feel thin. "George, hand over your keys and your store ID. Now." George's hand went instinctively to his chest, clutching the silver badge pinned to his navy blazer as if it were a shield that still had power. "Sir, I was just protecting the brand," George stammered, his eyes darting toward the customers who were now recording his downfall instead of Andrew's humiliation. "I followed the security protocol for unverified personnel. I thought he was." "You thought he was beneath you," Andrew cut in, his voice cold and precise. He didn't look angry. He looked disappointed, which was far worse. "That's the flaw in your protocol, George. You built a system that only functions for people who look like they already have money. You didn't protect the brand. You poisoned it." One of Julian's security team stepped forward, a silent prompt for George to comply. With trembling fingers, George unpinned the badge. It left a small, jagged hole in the fine fabric of his suit. He placed it on the glass counter next to the shredded remains of the manifest. Then, he fished a heavy ring of keys from his pocket and set them down with a dull metallic clink. The sound seemed to signal the end of his life as he knew it. "You're not walking out the front door, George," Julian said, pointing toward the back of the store, past the inventory cages and the break room. "You were very insistent that people in work uniforms don't belong in the showroom. Since you no longer represent this company, you're just a man in a suit who has overstayed his welcome." George looked at the main entrance, the wide glass doors he had spent 5 years guarding like a king. He looked at the street where his car was parked, then back at the dark, narrow hallway leading to the alleyway and the trash compactors. "You want me to leave through the service exit?" he whispered, the irony finally sinking in. The same one you told me to find, Andrew reminded him. The one near the dumpsters. It's a bit of a walk, but don't worry, the sidewalk is public property. You can limp all you want out there. The security guard placed a firm hand on George's elbow and began to guide him away. George stumbled, his confidence stripped away, looking smaller and older than he had 10 minutes ago. As he was led down the service corridor, the staff watched in total silence. No one offered a handshake. No one said goodbye. The heavy steel door at the far end of the hallway groaned open and then slammed shut with a definitive, echoing thud. George Reed was gone, exited through the very back door he had used as a weapon against a man he thought was just a delivery guy. Julian Vane picked up the heavy ring of keys George had abandoned on the glass counter. The showroom was silent, the kind of silence that follows a sudden explosion, where everyone is still checking to see if they're okay. Julian looked at the keys, then his gaze moved across the faces of the staff until it settled on Sarah Jenkins. She was still standing near the water station, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, looking as though she expected to be scolded for getting involved. "Sarah," Julian said, his voice carrying through the room without effort. She stepped forward, her movements hesitant. Julian held out the keys. "I saw what happened on the feed before we walked in. I saw you offer a seat to a man who was hurting when everyone else was busy filming his pain. This branch doesn't need a manager who knows the price of watches. It needs a leader who knows the value of people." Sarah stared at the keys in his palm, her eyes wide with shock. "Sir, I've only been here 6 months. And in 6 months, you've shown more integrity than George Reed did in 5 years, Andrew added, his voice warm for the first time that day. He walked over to the counter, the pain in his knee still visible in his gait, but his presence was towering. "Take the keys, Sarah. You're the only one here who earned them." With trembling fingers, Sarah took the keys. A small, tentative round of applause started from a couple near the door and spread through the room. It wasn't the loud, performative cheer of a crowd. It was the quiet acknowledgement of a wrong being righted. Andrew adjusted the strap of his delivery bag one last time. He looked around the showroom, at the customers who were now looking at him with sheepish, embarrassed expressions, and at the staff who were suddenly very interested in their work. He reached down and picked up the largest piece of the shredded manifest from the floor, tucking it into his pocket as a souvenir. "A man's character is the only thing in this room that doesn't have a price tag," Andrew said, looking directly at the bystanders who had kept their phones out. "You can buy a watch that lasts a century, but you can't buy the dignity you lose when you treat someone like they're invisible." He didn't wait for a response. He turned and walked toward the front door, the glass sliding open automatically to let him out. He stepped onto the sidewalk, the afternoon sun hitting his faded cap and his brown uniform. To the people passing by on the street, he was just another delivery guy with a limp, making his way to the next stop. But as Andrew disappeared into the city crowd, the people inside Prestige timepieces knew exactly who he was, and they wouldn't forget him anytime soon. Respect isn't a prize you give to the wealthy. It's an obligation you owe to everyone. And today, that was the only thing delivered that mattered. The store felt different as the door clicked shut behind Andrew. The silence that remained wasn't cold anymore. It was reflective. People looked at the watches in the displays, then at their own reflections in the glass, wondering if they would have been the one to film or the one to help. Sarah held the keys tight, a heavy weight of responsibility that felt right for the first time in that building. Justice hadn't just been served, it had been delivered. Because at the end of the day, a suit is just fabric and a watch is just gears, but integrity is the only thing you take home with you. What would you have done? Would you have looked away? Or would you have been like Sarah? Tell us your thoughts in the comments below. If you believe that every person deserves respect regardless of their uniform, hit the like button and share this story. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a moment of justice. Until next time, remember, the world sees your clothes, but the wise see your heart.